James was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at the clock, which seemed to be moving differently than usual. Time crept by, and every minute lasted endlessly. He hadn't been able to sleep the last few nights. It all started with minor alarms, creaking floorboards, quiet rustles behind the wall, imperceptible changes in the familiar surroundings of the house. He convinced himself that it was just imagination, the result of stress at work and fatigue that accumulated every day. But there was something different that night. The unusual cold seemed to penetrate the walls, and even under the covers he felt vulnerable, as if someone was watching him. He got up several times, checked the windows and doors, and each time he made sure that everything was locked. But the feeling of someone else's presence did not go away. This paranoia started killing him. James couldn't concentrate on work. He missed important meetings, and his productivity plummeted. From time to time, he dozed off for a few minutes and then abruptly woke up in a cold sweat, with the feeling that someone had touched him or pulled his arm. But there was no one around. James's wife, Sarah, also noticed his concern. She tried to support him, but she looked depressed herself. Her face became haggard, and dark circles appeared under her eyes. She also started complaining of insomnia, although she used to fall asleep barely touching the pillow. Their home, which had always seemed cozy and safe, no longer gave them peace. One evening, over a cup of strong coffee, James shared his feelings with Sarah. "It's all fiction," she tried to reassure him, but her voice sounded uncertain. "We're both overworked. We just need to take a vacation." But deep down, James knew it wasn't just fatigue. Something was going on in this house. Every time he closed his eyes, it seemed to him that someone was walking around the room. He could hear faint footsteps, as if his bare feet were touching cold parquet. Sarah also woke up several times at night and claimed to have seen shadows flickering in the hallway. During the week, their sleep became more and more intermittent. Sometimes they couldn't sleep at all, just lay in the dark, listening to the disturbing sounds that faded and grew louder. Nightmares began to creep into their reality. James began recording what was happening on a dictaphone, and listening to the recordings, he actually heard extraneous noises, creaking doors, the soft rustle of clothes, as if someone was passing unnoticed by their bedroom. One day in the middle of the night, James heard a particularly loud slam of the door. He abruptly jumped out of bed and ran into the hallway. Sarah woke up too, but she stayed in bed, covered up to her chin with a blanket. Her eyes were wide open, and she couldn't utter a word. James walked down the hallway, shining his flashlight into every room, but found no one. All the doors were closed, the windows were locked. But when he returned to the bedroom, he saw a strange note on the floor. She was lying right by his side of the bed, although he was sure she wasn't there when he got up. It was a fragmentary phrase, written on a piece of paper. "Your dream is the end." James grabbed the note and looked back at Sarah, but she just shook her head, making it clear that she had no idea where it came from. They were both trying to find an explanation. Maybe it was just a joke. Someone had planted it during their absence. But there were no signs of forced entry in the house. Not a single window was open. After that night, the situation began to deteriorate. Every time they went to bed, James found new notes. They appeared in the most unexpected places. On the pillow, on the floor by the door, even in the bathroom. All of them contained short and creepy messages. "Don't sleep. You're next. Sleep is no longer your friend." One morning, after another sleepless night, James woke up to find his hands covered in bloody cuts. There was a knife on the bedside table, stained with blood. He tried to remember what had happened, but his mind refused to give out any memories. Sarah also didn't know how to explain the situation. She was terrified, but she did not back down, trying to support her husband. After a few days, Sarah started disappearing at night. James would notice that she wasn't around, and when he woke up, he would find her in the kitchen or in the basement, where she was sitting as if in a trance. Her eyes were wide open and her face was completely blank, as if her mind had left her body. She couldn't explain her actions and didn't remember how she got there. When James tried to take her to the doctor, she resisted. She became more and more aggressive, pushing him away, shouting that she didn't need help. This behavior was completely different from the Sarah he knew. At some point, James decided to install cameras in the house to find out what really happens at night. That night, they couldn't sleep again, but this time, James was sure he would find out the truth. About 3 o'clock in the morning, he heard a creaking sound. Not knowing what to expect, he turned on the monitor and saw Sarah slowly get out of bed and leave the room. He ran after her, but when he opened the door, he found that her footprints led to the basement. When he came downstairs, the scariest scene of his life awaited him. Sarah was standing against the wall with a knife in her hands, and there was a note written in blood on the floor. The words were unintelligible, but the meaning was obvious. James started shouting her name, but in response, she just looked at him as if she didn't recognize him. James moved slowly towards Sarah, trying not to provoke her. My heart was beating so loudly in my chest that it seemed as if its sound could be heard all over the house. He spoke softly, as if to a small child. "Sarah, put the knife down. It's not you. You don't know what you're doing." But she didn't answer. Her eyes, usually filled with warmth, were now empty. Her gaze was frozen and motionless. In his hands, the knife was slowly rising, its blade reflecting the dim light of the light bulb. James desperately tried to reach her. "I'm here, Sarah. It's me, your husband. You have to wake up." He took another step forward, and suddenly her face twisted into a terrible grimace. She took a step forward, holding the knife out in his direction. James didn't have time to react. Sarah hit him. The blade went through his forearm, leaving a deep cut. The pain was sharp, and he reflexively staggered back, clutching at the wound. Blood started dripping onto the floor, but James didn't think about it. His mind was working at its limit, trying to figure out what was going on with his wife. He should have stopped her, but he didn't want to hurt her. In an attempt to avoid being hit again, James grabbed the nearest chair and held it out in front of him like a shield. Sarah stopped abruptly. Her breathing became deep and uneven. She leaned forward as if she was going to jump at him with a knife. "Sarah, please," James almost whispered, knowing he didn't have much time. At that moment, something clicked. Sarah suddenly froze, her hand with the knife dropped, and she began to slowly come to her senses. Her gaze cleared, as if she had just woken up from a long nightmare. "James," her voice was trembling. What have I done?" She looked at her hands and screamed, dropping the knife. Her body shook and tears ran down her cheeks. James threw down his chair and, despite his pain, went to her, hugged her, trying to comfort her. She was sobbing, clinging to him, and despite his fear, he felt relieved that she had returned to herself. But this moment of calm did not last long. The note on the floor caught his attention again. He released Sarah and slowly bent down to pick her up. The blood was fresh, but he didn't remember any of them touching the paper. There were only 2 words written on it, but their meaning chilled him to the bone. "You're next." James could feel cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. Everything that was happening did not fit into my head. He looked at Sarah, who was still sobbing, and realized that something much darker was pulling them both in. The next morning, James decided to seek help. He called his old friend, a private investigator named Robert. Once, many years ago, Robert helped him in the investigation of a complex case. James trusted him, and right now he desperately needed someone who could look at their problem with a cool head. Robert arrived a few hours later. He was a sturdy man with sharp features and an attentive gaze that seemed to see right through. "You look like you haven't slept in weeks," Robert said as soon as he entered the house. "You have no idea what's going on here," James replied, pointing to a note that was neatly folded on the table. Robert examined the paper carefully, held it up to the light, and frowned. "This doesn't sound like the usual threats," he said at last. "But this is clearly not a child's game. The note was written with one purpose, to inspire fear. And it seems to have worked." James briefly explained everything that had happened in recent weeks. Robert listened attentively, nodding from time to time. When James got to the point with the knife, Robert raised his hand to stop him. "It's starting to get dangerous. Are you sure you can trust your wife?" "It's not her," James replied firmly. Robert sighed and looked around the room. He took a dictaphone out of his pocket and turned on the recording. "I want you to put this device on overnight. Write down everything that happens when you sleep. Maybe we can figure out what's going on here." The night came faster than James had expected. he felt that the air in the house had become even heavier. Robert installed several cameras and left a dictaphone in the bedroom. James and Sarah went to bed, although sleep was out of the question. They just lay in the dark, listening to every sound. It was 3 o'clock in the morning when James heard the same creaking sound as before. He turned on the monitor and watched Sarah slowly get out of bed. He tried to stop her, but her body moved as if at someone's command. The cameras showed her walking slowly towards the kitchen. There she took a knife and began to carve something on the table. James jumped out of bed and rushed to her. When he entered the kitchen, he saw Sarah standing at the table with a knife in her hand. There was another inscription carved on the surface of the table, deeply embedded in the wood. The last dream. At that moment, Sarah turned sharply to him, her eyes filled with a frightening emptiness again. James froze at the kitchen door, his gaze riveted on Sarah, who stood in menacing silence, holding a knife. There was no awareness in her eyes. He took a slow step forward, trying to keep his voice low, but his heart was pounding in his chest, as if trying to break out. "Sarah," he whispered, but the words seemed to disappear into the thick air. Her body suddenly jerked violently, and James realized that he didn't have time. In an instant, he lunged at her, hoping to knock the knife out of her hands. But Sarah was moving unexpectedly fast. She took a step back and held the knife out in front of her as if preparing to defend herself. His hands were soaked with sweat, but James still kept trying to find a way out. He knew that hurting her was the last thing he wanted, but every second brought her closer to the point where she could strike. "It's not you, Sarah. You don't have to do this." His voice was louder now, closer to desperation. She did not react. Her face remained gloomy, her eyes empty. It seemed as if something inside her had died and only a shell remained, driven by an external force. At that moment, James heard a sound, a low, barely audible whisper, as if someone was talking to his wife, but he couldn't make out the words. "Who are you?" he shouted into the void, hoping that somehow this creature that controlled Sarah would hear him. Her face suddenly twisted into an agonized grimace, and James heard a hoarse whisper coming from her throat. "The last dream." The words she said seemed to snap him out of his stupor. He realized that it was all related to the records they were finding. Fear gripped his mind, but James knew he had to act. He lunged forward, grabbing Sarah's hand at the last moment, pointing her knife to the side. They fought for several seconds, which seemed like an eternity. James, using all his strength, was able to knock the knife out of her hand. He quickly threw it aside and grabbed her shoulders tightly, trying to hold her back. Sarah suddenly began to twitch, her body trembling, as if something was suffocating her from the inside. She opened her mouth, but instead of words, a strange, uneven sound came out of her throat, a mixture of whispers and moans. James tried to hold her down, but she struggled with incredible strength. Sarah suddenly froze and looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. She seemed to have recovered, at least for a moment. "James, help me," she whispered, her voice trembling, but before he could respond, her body started shaking again, and she collapsed to the floor. James rushed to her, trying to bring her to her senses, but Sarah did not react. Her breathing became ragged, and her pulse weakened. "Sarah!" James shouted, but there was no answer. He was desperately trying to find something that could help, but everything was happening so fast. At that moment, the phone rang. James took out his phone with shaking hands. It was Robert. "What's going on?" the detective asked. "Sarah?" James couldn't find the words. "She is?" He can't breathe. "What should I do?" "James, listen to me carefully," Robert said calmly. "I just finished checking the cameras. Whatever's going on, it's not just about your house. There seems to be more to it than that. Perhaps all this has something to do with your neighbors. You and I were talking about the fact that strange things started happening, not only with you. I'm on my way." James, trembling with fear and helplessness, put down the phone and looked at his wife. She was lying on the floor, barely breathing, but her eyes began to blur again, as if some force was getting the better of her again. Suddenly, the door burst open, and Robert burst into the house. He quickly examined Sarah, and then pulled out a small inhaler from his pocket. "This should help her recover," he said, spraying the product over her face. Sarah started coughing, and her breathing gradually steadied. Robert looked around the room and then looked at James. "You have to tell me. What else happened before that? It couldn't all have started with one incident." James gathered his thoughts and began to talk about all the strange events that took place in the house, from the unexplained notes to Sarah's behavior. As he talked, he realized that these events could not be accidental. Robert frowned. "I'll start checking on the neighbors," he said. "Perhaps they know something or have noticed it before. But something tells me that you are not the only ones who have faced this nightmare." He left James with his wife, going further in the footsteps. James was left alone with Sarah, hoping that the nightmare was finally over. However, he felt that the solution to this horror was still far away. James was sitting next to Sarah. Her breathing became even, but she remained unconscious. His mind raced in search of answers, but fear and despair, like a poisonous fog, overshadowed all thoughts. He tried to calm himself down, thinking that Robert would be able to find out something from the neighbors, but the silence in the house began to weigh on him again. Minutes passed and suddenly James heard the front door creak open. He turned around, expecting to see a detective, but instead a stranger was standing in the hallway. His face was hidden under the shadow of a hood, and in his hand he held a small, shiny object that seemed familiar to James. It was a hammer. "Who are you? What do you need?" James shouted, getting up from his knees. The stranger did not answer. He moved forward slowly, the hammer swinging in his hand. James felt a chill in his spine. He was trapped. Sarah remained unconscious, and the chances of protecting them both seemed slim. Sarah, wake up!" he shouted, but her eyes never opened. The man kept coming closer. With every step he took, the air around them became unbearably heavy, as if the house itself refused to protect them. James desperately grabbed a chair that stood next to the kitchen table. This was his last chance, but the stranger was faster. He swung the hammer, and just as James had time to lift the chair, the blow landed on his arm. A sharp pain went through my whole body. The chair fell out of his hands, and the hammer rose into the air again, ready for the next blow. The silence in the room was broken only by James's hoarse breathing and the stranger's heavy footsteps. He realized that he couldn't win. But just as the stranger was preparing to deliver the decisive blow, Sarah suddenly stood up. She was not conscious. Her movements were automatic, like a puppet's. Her eyes remained closed, but she moved as if she was being guided by something. Sarah slowly approached the man with the hammer and suddenly yanked him by the shoulder. The man froze, not expecting an attack, but it only distracted him for a moment. He pushed her hard, and Sarah fell to the floor, hitting her head on the edge of the table. James screamed, rushing towards her, but at that moment the hammer crashed right into his temple. Everything became dark. James was sitting next to Sarah. Her breathing became even, but she remained unconscious. His mind raced in search of answers, but fear and despair, like a poisonous fog, overshadowed all thoughts. He tried to calm himself down, thinking that Robert would be able to find out something from the neighbors, but the silence in the house began to weigh on him again. Minutes passed, and suddenly James heard the front door creak open. He turned around, expecting to see a detective, but instead a stranger was standing in the hallway. His face was hidden under the shadow of a hood, and in his hand he held a small shiny object that seemed familiar to James. It was a hammer. "Who are you? What do you need?" James shouted, getting up from his knees. The stranger did not answer. He moved forward slowly, the hammer swinging in his hand. James felt a chill in his spine. He was trapped. Sarah remained unconscious, and the chances of protecting them both seemed slim. Sarah, wake up!" he shouted, but her eyes never opened. The man kept coming closer. With every step he took, the air around them became unbearably heavy, as if the house itself refused to protect them. James desperately grabbed a chair that stood next to the kitchen table. This was his last chance. But the stranger was faster. He swung the hammer, and just as James had time to lift the chair, the blow landed on his arm. A sharp pain went through my whole body. The chair fell out of his hands, and the hammer rose into the air again, ready for the next blow. The silence in the room was broken only by James's hoarse breathing and the stranger's heavy footsteps. He realized that he couldn't win. But just as the stranger was preparing to deliver the decisive blow, Sarah suddenly stood up. She was not conscious. Her movements were automatic, like a puppet's. Her eyes remained closed, but she moved as if she was being guided by something. Sarah slowly approached the man with the hammer and suddenly yanked him by the shoulder. The man froze, not expecting an attack, but it only distracted him for a moment. He pushed her hard, and Sarah fell to the floor, hitting her head on the edge of the table. James screamed, rushing towards her, but at that moment the hammer crashed right into his temple. Everything became dark. When Robert returned to the house a few hours later, a terrible picture awaited him. James was lying on the floor without signs of life. Sarah was next to him. Her head was covered in blood. Both bodies were motionless, and there was a heavy, musty silence in the air. Robert, cautiously looking around the house, did not find any traces of an outsider. However, in one of the rooms he found a note that seemed to have been left in a hurry. "We are all subject to their will. Who's next?" He froze, realizing that this story was over, but her dark shadow still hung over the house.